what I'm hoping for this session is that we will discuss new ways of constituting, defending, and strengthening democracy at the time of the pandemic. I think we'll still try to kind of limit, as Jeff did, to each person answering that question to 5 minutes, so that we can have a more open discussion about this topic as it relates to all the work that we've done previously, as well as these papers. In fact, what I'm hoping is that these papers start that discussion. So, Chiang Lu, please.
Thanks, Jeff. It's my great pleasure to present my piece on the Chinese nationalism amid the pandemic here. So first, I want to give a short presentation about my paper. So it's basically about the Chinese young nationalists amidst the COVID-19, which reflected by a really interesting event. I call it dairy event. So basically, the public opinion in China experienced a shift from really critical on government pressure, government policy and measures, to a really pro-government nationalist sentiment during the development of COVID-19 in China. And in the beginning, since the outbreak originated in China, and people were so panicked about the situation, and they didn't know what's going to happen in the future. And at this time, their focus were on how the local government can contain the situation and be more critical on the government measures. While the COVID-19 happened in more and more many other countries, and people find, oh, okay, so the situation is not only happening in China, and our containment measure does work, and people gradually develop a stronger nationalist sentiment. And at this time, there's a diary on living and through the pandemic in China, written by a senior Chinese author, who's also the chair of the Hubei Writers Association, become a flashpoint for the ascendant nationalism in China. So this diary was basically not a planned writing project, but a response to an invitation by a journal editor in China, who asked the author to write about her lockdown experience in Wuhan, which is also the epicenter in China. And at first, she did not even expect to write it daily, but made the 60 daily records from January to March, and also put all of the diary on her social media account. And this diary kind of also witnessed the public opinions shift during the COVID-19 pandemic. As in the April, more and more people start to question her intention of writing, keeping this diary and post it online, and especially her intention to publish overseas, like in the US and Germany right now. And that becomes the flashpoint on social media to have a heated debate on the diary, and like, why did she trying to publish this overseas? Because many nationalists regard her diary gonna be a representation of the national scars, which is the experience of most ordinary people in China during the pandemic, and also accuse her, the author, of not defending the national pride, join the anti-China industry overseas. And another interesting response to the diary from the nationalist group is a rap produced by a young Chinese musician who used her rap to diss the author and got a lot of support from the social media and also the website where she posted her music video. And so this rap is basically a partisan presentation of the opponents and supporters' opinions on the diary and also her own comments. And the main lyrics of the rap is to question Fang Fang, who is the author of the diary's intention to publish it, and also the information source of the diary, and also in general the morality of the author of the diary. And since Fang Fang, who is the author of the diary, is also the chair of the Writers Association in China of Hubei province, and so the rapper, and she portrayed her, the author, as the elite and also the liberal intellectual, while she defended herself and also all the opponents of the diary as the ordinary people in the rap. And on the other hand, she also, the musician also attributed the bully and discrimination against overseas Chinese people to the diary as well. And she believed the publication of the diary overseas will make more foreigners have a negative impression on China. Well, actually the diary does not really have too many negative information. It's more about the real feelings of the ordinary people experience amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. So my arguments about the flashpoint, the diary event, is basically, I think, it reflects the social tensions between intellectual elite and the young nationalist populists, I call them. And so the reason there's the split between the two groups is basically, first, there is a generational differences for the established intellectual group in China and the young populist nationalists who were born and grown up in the rising China, but also with a gradually bounded internet environment. So basically the internet Great Wall of China to divide the mainstream Western social media and the Chinese internet environment. And also in the recent decades, there's also more and more propaganda or ideological control from the government on the social media. And for this younger generation, they kind of have more influence from the government ideological control. And on the other hand, this the internet wall or internet boundary between the West and China also lead to a long-existing misunderstanding between China and the West. And since Chinese people cannot get access to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and the two different community cannot really communicate. And that is also people's concern about, like, if we don't have the internet wall, and in the very beginning of the outbreak, maybe the Western countries or people can have the information to the outbreak earlier than the government or the communication between the government or WHO something, and that might actually help the Western world react to the situation earlier.
Right.
Yeah. So that's basically.
I think that what you've done is you've kind of given a picture of in some ways a new arena of public contestation, very much influenced by the power of the party and its censorship, but there seems to be for us who want to have faith in the young, a counterintuitive process going on here where an established author is using the simple method of the diary to reflect on the personal experiences with the pandemic and the authenticity is actually being attacked by a young rapper and her supporters articulating with the official party line. So I think that's very, very interesting to know about, even if it's a little depressing. So Pawel Knut, it will shift our geographical focus from China back to Poland, and but consider some unique new responses by the LGBT movement in Poland to the crisis of COVID-19, and actually point to ways, I think, that coalitions, not only of regressive coalitions, but more progressive coalitions may be possible. Pawel, please.
Thank you, Jeff. I will start by saying that the session's question is a big and complex one, especially if we keep in mind all the diagnoses that we have shared today and yesterday. In my piece, I'm trying to highlight at least some points that I hope might be helpful for us to answer this question. And so I'm analyzing some interesting phenomena that are happening right now as we are speaking in Poland among the LGBT community. And you probably know that the current situation of this community is really, really bad. Even though that the Polish authorities didn't declare the formal state of emergency, the LGBT community lives in a de facto state of emergency. And just to give you one evidence confirming that, I will say that ILGA Europe has just published the latest edition of the Rainbow Europe report. And this year, for the first time in the history of this report, Poland was ranked as the worst place to live for LGBT people in the entire European Union. So Poland is a country where we have LGBT-free zones declared by local municipalities. It is a country where trucks with homophobic slogans are traveling freely around the cities. And it's also a country where last year we had an attempt to bomb the Equality March. But despite this situation, after the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, we've started observing a rush of new strategies and actions of the Polish LGBT movement. And for instance, activists are making protective masks and handing them out to hospitals and homeless shelters in cities within these LGBT-free zones. We've got also some LGBT NGOs that are also providing free psychological counseling to medical professionals, infected persons, their relatives, but also for people who are under quarantine, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. There is also a very interesting example from Poznań of a transgender NGO whose members organized first aid courses for everyone who is willing to participate, but they also work as a paramedics, which is amazing to follow them on Facebook. So it's clearly visible that the current crisis leads not to a standstill, but to a new wave of activist experiments. And I want us now to think for a second of the strategies and the pandemic itself through a very specific conceptual framework, because I think that today's pandemic, like HIV pandemic and other traumatic experiences we've witnessed in the past, can be described as a liminal experience. It's like a threshold. Pre-pandemic reality is already non-existent. Post-pandemic reality has not been born yet. We are in this very peculiar, for sure only temporary, but a very peculiar situation in which many things are turned upside down, making the alternative visions of future, at least theoretically, possible. And maybe what we are witnessing in the actions of the Polish LGBT activists is an attempt to reinvent at least some areas of their political imaginary. And I'm referring in my piece to the example of the LGBT community, also because I believe that in the past we have witnessed an example of a successful radical social change that happened during the pandemic and thanks to the pandemic. And I'm thinking here of American LGBT movement in the 1980s and 1990s during the HIV pandemic. Back then, this experience of a plague was used to mobilize the community around the emotion of anger. It helped to stir up strategic disruption of several public spaces through direct actions. And I think that this switch in a strategy back then was effective, and it forced, for instance, the government to accelerate national drug testing procedures. For me, this comparison I try to draw between the historical situation and the current pandemic provoked me also to start thinking of how the Polish LGBT movement can best utilize this window of opportunity brought by COVID-19. And I think that there are three important issues that came to my mind that are, of course, interrelated, but they might be helpful to solve this puzzle. I'm not sure if I will have enough time to tell you about all of these three issues, but I will
start by listing them.
First one, the first one is about telling good stories, and more specifically about telling a convincing story that justifies the need for a positive social change. COVID-19 affects not only LGBT community, it also affects society as a whole. It's a very interesting situation. It's creating a situation in which we are all strangers. And this feeling of anxiety and confusion opens the opportunity to go beyond divisions and conflicts that organize our pre-academic life. And experiencing the pandemic as experiencing of any other important collective events is a subject to a meaning-making process. We can, of course, simply we can stick to the existing discourses and collective practices to interpret what is happening to us. And for sure, Kaczynski will try to do that. However, I would not reject this possibility of an alternative narrative. One example that could be used as a vision of a new, better political imaginary was described recently by Judith Butler in Butler's book on nonviolence. And Butler says that the radical change is possible only if we are able to accept the fact that our lives are interdependent and equally grievable, regardless of our political views, sexual orientation or gender identity, etc. And I think that the experience of pandemic reminds us, like no other misfortune, how dependent to others our own lives are. But of course, the real problem is how to translate this abstract story into specific actions. And I don't believe that there is one or a simple answer to this question. What the LGBT activists seem to be trying to do recently is to focus on local issues and work closely with local communities. Right now, this means focusing on healthcare, but post-pandemic reality will soon bring many new social problems that will require an intervention. And I think here of access to housing and food, etc. So this was the first issue. The second one is about tactics. As Elżbieta Korolczuk has already mentioned, I think yesterday, many of the existing strategies used also by Polish LGBT movement have been appropriated by right-wing organizations. And this interception of strategies, but also the fact that Polish society is deeply divided, people are enclosed in this bubble or clusters, but this makes the existing strategies ineffective. They help to mobilize people inside the bubbles, but at the same time, they polarize bubbles that are in conflict. And maybe the recent strategies applied by the Polish LGBT movement in the last few weeks, they herald a new chapter of political activism, one in which you might be more effective if you choose to strategically focus on the common aspects of our social identity. Butler's concept of interdependence and grievability may serve this role, actually. When Polish LGBT activists hand out protective masks, they send a very clear message. You need us and our support because we are all in this together. And the last issue that I think might be important is the issue of technology. Like forced confinement, which is experienced by many sectors of our societies, is deepening our dependence on the internet, on social media, and in general on technology. And for Paul Preciado, the situation creates perfect conditions for something that Preciado calls the cybernetic biosurveillance. That is a situation which enhances decollectivization and telecontrol, meaning shrinking the space for civil disobedience. And of course, I'm aware that new media are important for civil movements, and I will finish by saying this. It's important for civil movements as they help to spread information, they help to mobilize, they help to fund the movement, and also to keep the movement alive during the hard times. But I think especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic era, we should be cautious not to mistake real social presence with virtual representation. Utku Balaban made a very interesting point in a piece that donors and beneficiaries should have a direct contact, not mediated by any other entities. And I believe that the same this also applies to technology, which should not become the predominant mode of our communication. Yeah, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
That's really interesting, and you know, all three papers are really interesting. It's really fascinating how these three papers kind of put together these kind of innovative ways of responding to the pandemic and the threat to democracy, and the kinds of responses that have been passed on to us, that we inherit, and really important, central to this session and the session before, is actually the struggle for human rights, and that's what you're going to tell us about, and I look forward to hearing from it.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a chance for us to introduce ourselves as the School of Human Rights. But first of all, I have to mention that the School of Human Rights is not an initiative which began to run during the pandemic, but it's a European Union funded project which has begun to run during the state of emergency in Turkey. And its official title is the Coping with the State of Emergency and Bringing Human Rights Academy to Society. Why we choose this name? I think I could briefly summarize the dynamics. Mm-hmm.
I just want to actually point out to everyone, as I recall, you're speaking to us from Turkey. Am I remembering correctly? Okay,
yes,
everyone should realize that.
I'm in Turkey and in Ankara. And our project is also running in Turkey. So first, let me introduce our background. I think it's very related with our issue, authoritarian regimes. We have two basic dynamics behind us. First of all, many of us now who are in the project were part of the Human Rights Center at the Faculty of Political Sciences in Ankara University. Yesterday, we discussed about centralization and localization. In our experience, this tension between the centralization on behalf of centralization was an experience for us in the Human Rights Center, because after the state of emergency, the rectorate centralized the Human Rights Center at the faculty for 40 years and closed it. And I think 1 month later, nearly all of us are dismissed because of signing the peace petition in Turkey. Therefore, these two dynamics, the centralization or the closure of the Human Rights Center at the faculty, and then the dismissal of peace academics, are the two basic dynamics behind the School of Human Rights. You know, over 2,000 scholars in Turkey signed peace petition in January 2016, and after the state of emergency in the summer of 2016, more than 400 scholars, including me, Nazan, Utku, Funda, Ali Rıza, we are all here, are purged from our universities. And Kerem was the head of the Human Rights Center at the faculty, and he resigned after our dismissals. But now we are working together at the School of Human Rights. So this is our background, and the School of Human Rights is a kind of a European Union project. What is our objectives? Our objectives is to create an alternative space for human rights studies in Turkey. It was a kind of a study area which was developing very slowly. But you know, after the purge and after the state of emergency, it is deeply demolished under authoritarian policies. So first of all, we would like to create an alternative academic sphere for still continuing to study human rights. Secondly, we would like to raise awareness amongst human rights NGOs for them to recognize and accept academic freedom as a separate and autonomous human right. And thirdly, we would like to provide academic input to civil society working in the field of human rights to support the capacity to deal with human rights violations. In brief, we would like to do what we used to do at the faculty, but this time we are moving out from the limits of the university, or we left the walls of the university, maybe not left, but purged, but we can say that we left maybe. So what is our project has? We have two components. On the one hand, we would like to promote academic freedom as a human right. And on the second hand, we are running the School of Human Rights. I will not go in detail. You could also check my paper, but I could say that we have, for the promotion of academic freedom as a human right, we have two reports on it, how the state of emergency affected the academic freedom in Turkey and how it affected the human rights study in Turkey. I could send it via chat to you after my presentation. And what we do at the School of Human Rights, first of all, it's a virtual and functional space. It's an online human rights education sphere. We have more than 20 courses on human rights. Although we do not give any credits or diploma, but only a certificate, the number of our participants since 1.5 years are more than 350 now. We have 6 weeks semesters and more than 100 people applies for every semester, and we only choose 50 of them for attending our online courses. It's free and voluntary, so they are free to organize their times. And I mentioned we have now 20 courses on human rights. What we also have a documentation center. We are publishing working papers on human rights issues in Turkey, or it could also be related with global human rights issues. And on the other hand, during the pandemic, we begin a new action. We begin to broadcast human rights under quarantine YouTube programs since April 2020. So we began to broadcast 11 programs until now on human rights issues during the pandemic. Why we do that? Because we realize that under the authoritarian regimes, as you all know, as you all mentioned, it's not able to reach the truths about the violations, human rights violations, not from the mainstream media or not from the academia in Turkey or from the universities in Turkey. Therefore, we began to broadcast these programs and deal with the issues, human rights issues rising under the pandemic, like social and economic rights.
I'm not as good as Jeffrey C. Isaac.
Okay, I'm finishing.
So try to, but Drew tries to finish up.
Okay, the last verse. During the pandemic, we expand our actions. We begin broadcasting YouTube channels, and now recently we are preparing to publish a blog on human rights. So it's very significant for us to be with you here because this blog will also have a kind of a budget for translation, and it will be a very good cooperation with all of you on this blog or with these YouTube channels. Maybe I can briefly summarize all this experience with you, and you could ask any questions you like to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The floor is open. I'm asking Lala to start. I don't know. I see Jeff Isaac.
Jeff Isaac has a question. Yes.
Okay. So Jeff, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. These are all great presentations. Thank you. I have a specific question for Elçin. It's a two-part question. How are you supporting yourself now? And how free are you? And like, even is a Zoom conversation putting you at risk?
Yes, I'm used to. So I'm the project coordinator. So nearly all of our staff are dismissed academics, project assistant, all the academics who are giving online lectures are purged academics. And during the surveys, also purged academics worked for the surveys. So I'm not sure, but I believe more than 40 purged academics are funded by this project. Am I at risk? Yes, yeah, I am. So I think you used to do with this. Our project is also under risk. What we do for this, we still do what we do. For example, if you check our survey results, it's very tricky now to talk about Kurdish issue, to teach about them, to talk about Armenian genocide or, you know, LGBT rights. But we do it at our courses. How we do it, we did not apply to Ministry of Education for becoming an official institute. So we are doing what we do, but we are not official. We are only, for now, we are only a project, European Union funded project, but we would like to develop it. I have to say that. We will not want to stop it because we now taste to create an academic sphere by ourselves.
So that Jeff's Isaac's graphic, I think, expresses all of our sentiment. I've noticed, I'm asking Lala to do this, but I noticed that one of the people who has made it possible for this project to proceed, Jonathan Fanton, raised his hand. So Jonathan, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, this has been a terrific session. I'm interested in whether the School of Human Rights is getting any help from international organizations like Human Rights Watch or Scholars at Risk or the Soros Network.
Not yet, but we are in cooperation with other solidarity academics in Turkey. We are not the only one. There are also other solidarity academics in Turkey founded by purged academics. What differentiates us is we are giving lectures online and we are especially working on human rights. This differentiates us. We are in connection with some foundations in Turkey, some German foundations, and some other foundations, international foundations like CDPR, but not in relation with the Scholars at Risk for now.
Well, if I can be of any help in making any connections to NGOs or university human rights programs, for example, Hunter College, where I work, also has a human rights project. I'd be very happy to do it. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. I think that the next person is Jacek Kucharczyk. Is that right, Lala? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. These were really great presentations, and I think every one of them needs to be discussed. But I have a question specifically to Pawel and his presentation. It's again very revealing to me, the information about how LGBT community is trying to become visible and in a positive way at this time of backlash against LGBT community. But my question is about the fact that this is the first time we have election campaign, I mean presidential campaign during the pandemics. But what's unusual also about this campaign is that for the first time, if I remember correctly, we have one openly gay candidate, Robert Biedroń. And I'm just curious to hear some of your reflections about whether you see the LGBT community making any effort to actually support his campaign, and you know, what's the relationship between all these activities that you describe and the fact that we have this candidate who is, to be honest, not doing great at this moment. So just trying to make this connection. I think I would love to hear some of your thoughts and insights. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. My general impression is that different LGBT organizations and initiatives, they support Robert Biedroń, like they support all opposition candidates. I think that they try to keep the same distance between them and those candidates. They, of course, are criticizing Robert Biedroń for his mistakes, but my general impression is that, you know, also because he is the first openly gay candidate, he's got the special status among the community. But at the same time, I think that the real question right now is whether whether the community will decide to support him or decide to support Rafał Trzaskowski, so the candidate of the main oppositional party. And I think right now we are witnessing this discussion within the movement, how to solve this. Maybe the movement will decide to see how this situation will unfold and will support Rafał Trzaskowski, you know, during the second run of the voting. We will see. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the answer to your question. The question is a real complex one. I hope that I at least.
No, thank you. No, that's very interesting. Thank you.
We have a question from Elżbieta Kuralczuk.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment more, because I think that the LGBT movement is doing a great job in trying to bridge this kind of polarization in the society through, for example, trying to reach out to local communities. But what I also see is that they are following the steps of American organizations, for example, and trying to move or stress more or use more litigation, for example. So now I just learned today that the people who created the Atlas of Hate, sort of a map where you had all those local municipalities which adopted declaration of no LGBT, sort of LGBT-free zones or different types of declaration which basically have this effect. Those young people are now being sued by Ordo Iuris Foundation. So it seems like there is a change in the strategies of the ultra-conservative movements in countries such as Poland, and also I see it also in other countries, where they really try to engage their opponents in long, costly, and very difficult legal battles, trying to really omit the debates around that, because quite a lot of people are against this kind of discriminatory practices, but they're trying to push towards certain solutions through, for example, litigation. So I see it as also a challenge for us as academics, but also as people who are more or less activists as well, because that would really require much more and different types of resources, both in terms of money and knowledge and know-how, to be offered to those movements.
Okay, then Maria.
I'm going to be short. I think we're running out of time. I think of all these wonderful efforts that are being described in this session in particular as heroic, and as, in a way, exemplifying obviously the best that can be done from a social, civil society kind of end of moving beyond this crisis. It's really impressive that people who are so vulnerable believe that it's their responsibility to change things to improve their, their life and the life of others. The larger problem, however, is it's not clear to me how possible it is to continue to rely on these efforts, and that for sure these efforts need to be connected with policy change, because you can't ask those who are vulnerable to always step up to the plate. I mean, I think of the LGBT examples that Pawel was giving. They're amazing initiatives, but they're putting all of you in danger, in real danger, personally, every day, I think. I mean, from what you're describing. And so we want to think about some of those risks as well, and try to construct a discourse that honors that and that pushes against just relying, on kind of how we're mobilizing ourselves informally, because that's obviously, I mean, when, like you said, we're in a liminal situation, but is this the model, or is this just a way to kind of start constructing different types of connections and visibility, but really it's not sustainable long term. And as Elżbieta was just talking about, once you start having others pushing against you legally and depleting your financial and human resources, then we're kind of left back to vulnerability. So that's it. Thank you.
Oh, is there anyone else?
We have Mark, and
Okay.
that's it.
Mark, and then I'll make a closing note.
Okay, thanks. I just had a quick question/comment, and that was with Chiang Lu's discussion of Fang Fang and Bo Peep. It seems to me that in China, but also in all of these authoritarian regimes, and this is sort of a kind of, despite obvious differences, a common thread, that Fang Fang was also one of her provocations was to say, what, we should be thanking you, the government? What are you, crazy? This is the People's Republic. We're the principals and you're the agent. And there was a huge campaign in 2008 after the Sichuan earthquake, in which the government launched a, thank us campaign. And we saw it in certainly this year again. And I think that's, I guess the question for Chiang Lu is, does Bo Peep and these nationalists, are they also supporting that narrative and saying, shut up and be grateful to the party for the great successes that they've achieved? But of course, you see this in the US, you see this in all these other contexts too, where Trump is demanding that, the governors thank him, that he has his name on the stimulus checks. And so I think, regardless of political institution or regime type, there is this uniformity in the government's attempting to turn the victims of the pandemic into the grateful subjects. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chiang Lu. Otherwise,
Can I have a short response?
Yes, go ahead.
I think, it's really similar this time, like during the crisis. It's typical government strategy to construct the situation abroad and the better situation in China, and to make people feel grateful or lucky to be born in the country. And especially this time, like recent news, it's always like how horrible the situation in the US. Well, yeah, it does, but like the strategy in their propaganda to emphasize the better situation in China, and that is all the contribution of the government and our system. And that is also what they emphasize recent years, like we need to be more confident in our social system, which is the party state, and to emphasize advantages of it in some cases, but they never make people realize something. They're like the right of the citizens, and they deserve the protection or the welfare. That is not something like a favor from the government. Yeah, so I agree with you. Yeah, on this. Thank you.
So I thanks to you all for a great presentation and a very interesting discussion. I just got a note from Elżbieta Matynia, who asked me if to ask Mark about something that happened in Hong Kong last night. She said, I don't know what it is. She said something important happened last night in Hong Kong. Do I want to ask Mark? And the answer is yes. And maybe you would share your observations about whatever that is.
Okay, it was, I don't want to say I was predicting it, but the point I talked about yesterday about the national security, so-called anti-terrorism legislation that Beijing has been pressing and saying the Hong Kong government, you have to pass it soon. Well, last night the announcement came that at tomorrow's, it would be Friday, Chinese time, which is tonight, our time in the US, that at the National People's Congress, they will, in fact, they'll go ahead and pass their own national security legislation for the Hong Kong government, so that there's no need for the Hong Kong government to pass its own national. So we're getting to one country, one system is what was the news this morning in the press. Faster paced move to one country, one system.
So the conflict is escalating, and the interesting or the project of colonialization, as you put it, it is being pushed forward. The question is, under these conditions, can there be any response? And I think that that's actually going to be the topic in general of our next session, which is thinking about what Maria said about the papers this session. Okay, these are heroic civil responses to very pressing concerns, sometimes dangerous. In the case with Pawel's presentation, actually surprising. And the element of surprise in social movements, I think we shouldn't minimize it. ACT UP was surprising in the United States in the 1980s because it dared to disrupt the heteronormative kind of order. And now in Poland, the LGBT community is surprising by treating as fellow human beings people who deny their own humanity. And that generates power. But then how does that relate to these states that are amassing power? And how do we act effectively in response in a world of social distancing, where we are not easily connecting with each other physically, even if we can, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to use this technology, even if we can meet each other virtually. So let's have another break, and then turn to our last session. I fear that our general discussion is going to have to follow the next session. Maybe all of the presenters, such as me and Elżbieta, the facilitator, will be disciplined so that we can have more time to have a general discussion about all the incredibly interesting issues that are now on our agenda. So let's take a break.